Welcome, everybody. I can see that there's a big sort of global audience, and that to me is really cool because it allows that learning to be shared. And it talked about real lessons and taking a human factors and a systems thinking approach. Before we get going, I know Richard Cullen is on here. He's done a fantastic job writing up 7 posts in the Human Factors in Diving Facebook group and posting those there and putting those from an objective, as much as possible, position, point of view. Because as we go through this, you realize there is lots of information missing from other parties because the majority of the information we've got is from the court submission and the videos that were recorded with Dive Talk on their channel. As I said, I don't have all the answers. And one of the things we'll realize as we go through this is we create our own understanding, our sense making about this. Now, why am I the sort of person to be able to talk about this? My background, military aviation. I spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force. I was a flight commander, a flight instructor on Hercules Squadron, got about 2,500 hours of flying. And then in 2004, I did a master's degree in aerospace systems, which is really a crash course in anything to do with aerospace. But importantly, it was about creating a systems thinking mindset that capabilities is what we were trying to procure for the military aren't just equipment, they're not just people, they're not just procedures. What we had is this idea called tepid oil, which we brought all of these things together. And the idea was that I became an intelligent customer. I had a broad knowledge about not a lot. And that's really where I still sit at the moment. I then went to work off in flight trials, in research and development, and then systems engineering requirements management. And then in 2015, I left the Air Force and then set up what was the predecessor to that, Human Diver, and also Human in the System. And the idea of bringing that knowledge from high-risk aviation into the diving space and other industries as well. And I've worked in multiple different sectors. And fundamentally, people are people. It's just the stories that change. So in the diving space, probably about 800 dives to my name. Most of my training in diving is being done through GUE. GUE Tech 2, so Advanced Trimix, Open Circuit, and Normoxic on a JJ CCR. 2019, I wrote Under Pressure, and then in 2020, the documentary If Only was released, and that tells a learning story, a tragic fatality through the lenses of human factors and system safety. And a big thank you to David Kincannon, who's on here as well, to help hook myself up with Ashley and then the dive team. Last year, I finished a master's degree in human factors and system safety, and the title of that was Storytelling to Learn. And what we were talking about here is what are the barriers that enable or detract storytelling? And there were a number of things that came out of that, and probably 2/3 of the factors that are identified relate at the organizational level. It's not just individuals, but also much higher level. And I'll touch a little bit that as a presentation. I run 2 fatal diving accident inquiries, one for the Ministry of Defence, looking at an open circuit fatality, and one for the New Zealand Defence Force, looking at a rebreather fatality where the diver went hypoxic. Deliver some training for the Belgian military and also for the Canadian military teams in Toronto. What I want to start off with is not quite a gratuitous clip, but it's to bring this stuff to life. And in what we're talking about here is a clip from Maverick, where the Dark Star jet is taking off on the runway and overflies Ed Harris, who's standing at the end of the runway. Now, there's a bit jittery there, unfortunately, because the bandwidth of playing this. But those who've seen it will notice, will recognize that the roof on that cabin actually lifts up. Now, 2 years ago, I got the pleasure of being able to present at Edwards Air Force Base for their annual safety day. And the guy before me was basically the video coordinator for Maverick. And he talked about that fly past event. And what they did is they basically simulated, or they had an F-18, one of the Blue Angels jets that did this low pass, and it's one of their sort of signature things that they do. One of the aircraft, it's another thing. They start off at about 500 feet, and they come down to around the sort of 80 to 100-foot mark. Now, when they flew over this on the final pass, so they did all the sort of the rehearsals, and Ed Harris wasn't there. And then when they came to do the live shoot, Ed Harris is there. They flew over, and that dust and literally destruction that happened was real. And what they hadn't realized is that as the aircraft came over the top, the jet wash and the wash from that lifted the roof off that building and dropped back down again. And they were not expecting that to happen. And the director was like, oh my God, we've nearly killed somebody. So the margins they were dealing with were really small. And just bear that in mind as we go through this session. The next bit to think about is this guy here, MacArthur Wheeler. Now, some of you might know about him. He's famous because he tried to rob a bank. Well, he did rob a bank in 1995, but he put lemon juice on his face to make him invisible. And you just sit there going, you have got to be joking. But in his mind, because he knew that lemon juice could be used as invisible ink, he thought that by rubbing his face in lemon juice, then he would be invisible to the security cameras. He wasn't. He was picked up. And this story piqued the interest of two researchers, Dunning and Kruger, and they came up with this idea, this theory around the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people are incompetent and unaware. They don't know what they don't know, and even worse, they don't know that they don't know. There's a double whammy, and this was the title of the presentation I gave at Tech Dive 16, and you can see that on the Human Diver YouTube channel. So bear in mind that those two key points we're talking about. One is that when margins are small, we can't rely on luck, and those margins may be small anyway, or they may be eroded. And the second piece is we don't know what we don't know, and even worse, we don't know that that's the case. Now, one of the things within the Human Dive, we talk about safety, and we ask people, what does safety mean? And often people put it down as an absence or a freedom from harm or injury. But the problem is what we're trying to do is measure an absence, something that doesn't exist. This is a much better definition from a guy called Todd Conklin, who works in the New View safety space. So safety is not just the absence of accidents or incidents, but rather the presence of barriers and defenses and the capacity of the system to fail safely. Now, what does that mean, the capacity to fail safely? And some of you may have joined straight away or early on heard me talking to David about how do you fail safely in say, a live fire situation. Now, in the diving situation, what we're trying to do is put training, skills, equipment, these non-technical skills like teamwork, decision-making, communications, psychological safety. What we're trying to do there is prevent an adverse event from occurring in the first place. But when something does go wrong and we end up having an entanglement, a rapid ascent, an overweighting situation, what we need to then have is some measures by which we don't end up with a fatal outcome. So that could be teamwork, it could be oxygen, it could be having EMS, it could be having your emergency action plan in place. It could be about a whole bunch of things that are there. This image from Volvo from the sort of the 1990s brings this stuff to life. We're boxy, but we're safe. And the idea here is that they built this secure cabin compartment in which the driver and the passengers would remain safe. And this is one of the big things about crumple zones. And interestingly, there are vehicles in the States that you can't drive in the UK because they are considered unsafe, not just from a passenger and driver point of view, but also from a pedestrian point of view. So we also need to look at how is the pedestrian protected. And if anybody is follows on podcasts, there's a podcast that I run called How Did It Make Sense? And there's a brilliant author on there called Jessie Singer, and she talks about automotive safety in the States and how bad it is because it's a systems problem. Now, what we're trying to do is develop people, systems, teams, organizations to be resilient, to be able to predict what might go wrong. Through storytelling, through planning, through an understanding the procedures we've got, and then we're going to monitor how well people do and undertake their activities. And that could be feedback at a team level. It could be in the training environment, diver training environment. It could be feedback from the class back to the training agency. It could be from the training agencies into bodies like the Recreational Scuba Training Council or the Rebreather Training Council or RESA, the Rebreather Education Safety Association or Safety Association. So the bit here is we need feedback to help us learn. Now that feedback also helps us adapt because our training is finite. We can't train for everything. But what we can do is we can learn from other people and we can change our behaviors accordingly. And we learn, we adapt. And this happens all the time within mature systems. So what I'm going to do now, set the scene. I'm going to talk about 4 stories, 4 simple linear stories. And we'll talk about these as first stories. The first one is the Challenger loss, in which an O-ring vaporized on the launch within the solid rocket booster. And that's what the little red square is. And that's a still from the video. And you can see that that's happened. Now, it would be quite easy to turn around and say, well, the engineers didn't do their job the night before because they didn't shout out. The organization was pushing for timelines. And in this situation, you might just say this concept of normalization of deviance, which we'll come on to in a minute, it's because they broke the rules. But it's not as simple as that. Next story I'll talk about is, because each time somebody comes in, the focus changes. Next one is the shoot down of 2 Black Hawk helicopters by 2 US Army Black Hawk helicopters by 2 US Air Force F-15s. Highly trained crews. They visually identified the aircraft, the Black Hawks, as enemy aircraft and fired them and shot them down, killing everybody on board. This one here is Martin Bromley, and this was the motivation for me to record If Only. Martin was an airline pilot, and his wife had gone in for a routine operation, and they gave her a general anesthetic. And unfortunately, the anaesthetists didn't notice that things were going wrong. And it wasn't until 8-10 minutes later that they decided, we can't intubate her, we can't ventilate her, we better wake her up. We'll give her some anti-anesthetic drugs. I don't know, there's some medics on here who'll tell you what the opposite of anesthetic is. And that then they tried to bring her around, they put her in recovery and realized that she was in a coma. They called Martin in, and he turned the life support machine off 3 days later. And we'll talk a little bit more about that story in a minute. And then this one here, Linnea Mills, is an 18-year-old who went on an adventure dive to do a Drysuit speciality within that. And in freezing cold waters, when snow and ice is on the ground, with 45 pounds of lead zipped into her BC pockets and her Drysuit pockets, and she ended up sinking and drowning in a lake in Glacier National Park. Now, that sets the scene around simple first stories. So what I'm going to do now is go into a little bit about first stories and second stories and understand the complexity of what's happening. So first stories are those simple linear ones. They're full of counterfactuals: should have, could have, would have, failed to, lack of situation awareness, incomplete communication, poor leadership. What we use are these negative terms to describe why the event occurred, because we know what the outcomes are. We can easily join the dots looking backwards and go failed to, didn't do, and all of these sort of negative terms. They don't really help us in terms of learning because they tell us what didn't happen. What we don't understand is what did happen and what the conflicts, the tensions, the goals that are all there, what those are, the messy stories that exist in the real world. Now, it takes time for those stories to emerge because we've got to create an environment, we've got to have a proper learning process. And anybody who's seen any sort of work that I've done in the just culture space, we can either blame or we can learn. And those are pretty much mutually exclusive. And some might say, well, when we blame, people will learn from that. But unless you actually change the environment in which the activity is going, what happens then is you drive the learning stories underground, because those stories that would help us learn are also the same stories that are used when it comes to criminal litigation situations. And I understand that that is a societal thing, but bear in mind that when we've got a conflict between pinning something on somebody and trying to learn, where we get that context-rich story, there is a conflict, there's a tension there, and it doesn't help. And if we then just turn around to, there we go, this bit about incompetence, when we don't have a full story, it's easy to judge that, make that judgment. And anybody who's involved in let's say, safety management that's there, we've got rules, processes, procedures, and we write them down, we share those with people, and then they go out the front door and they look at the messiness of world. And you sit there going, how do I do this? Now, a lot of the training agency materials are intentionally vague to give the instructors and the dive centers some level of freedom to operate in their sort of space and deal with those tensions. Now, the difficulty is if you don't understand why rules are being written and put in place, then it's much easier to break them and not hold ourselves accountable as a team. So when we have big gray areas, that can help us until it goes wrong. And then we sit there and go, well, why didn't you? And we start using those counterfactuals. Now, in a simple world like dominoes, cause and effect is quite obvious. We knock the dominoes, they topple. And to stop the dominoes toppling, we just pull one or two out and everything would be okay. And this is this sort of break the link in the chain, or sorry, break the link, and then the chain stops happening. Now, that works for simple mechanical systems. I would say probably the most complex piece of the most complicated, simple bit of gear we're talking about is a rebreather. Not the electronics, but basically the mechanical side of things. And a complicated system takes this a little bit further. And what we're dealing with here is lots of different components. Now, this tower is complicated. I could knock it over and I could probably rebuild it in this exactly the same way. When your rebreather, your camera, your scooter, your BCD, your regulators break and a component breaks, what happens is the service center takes that component out, fixes it, puts it back together again, and it works. It's an ordered system. It's pretty easy to sort things out as long as you've got a little bit of training and a manual. The problem is when we start to introduce people, and then we have complexity. And what we're talking about, dynamic, it moves, it's adaptive. Intractable means that when I start looking at the system and seeing how it's behaving, the system's moving on. So I might be able to fix this, but actually it's moved on. So I can't continuously fix things. And the easy way to make sense of it is looking backwards. I can't make sense of it looking forwards. Now, there's a model that many will have seen is James Reason's Swiss cheese model, and it's drawn statically because you can't do dynamics in books. But in reality, these holes open, they close, they move around, and it's only when the holes line up and we end up with this closing of the thing finishes, we end up with an adverse event. Now, the thing is that when I'm at the point of action, I believe that the person to the left of me is doing their job properly. And if they've made a mistake, it will be obvious and I will be able to pick it up. So I do my job. I'm an instructor or I'm a diver, I'm a student on a class. I then think that if I've made a mistake, the person to the right of me in time will pick up those issues as well. So we have this sort of assumption that we've got sort of defenses in depth, but in reality, that's not necessarily the case. And afterwards, it's really easy to look back up the tube and we can identify where the failures are. But in real time, where those holes are moving and opening and closing, we can't see the interactions that are going on. So one of the frameworks that I used for my research was this one from Jens Rasmussen. And what he's talking about is policies, government policy, regulator, company, technical operational management, the operators, the staff, and then the work, the actions that are involved. and we have guidance, direction and guidance coming down, and we have feedback that goes back up the system. Now, I use a Jenga tower, a different colored Jenga tower for the trainings that I deliver, both in diving, but mainly in the non-diving space. The stuff on the left-hand side in this video, we make the assumption that it's perfect. Now, it's a bit jittery, unfortunately, but if we look top down on this tower, everything looks hunky-dory. It's all perfect. But actually, if I go out onto a dive site and I see an instructor teaching, there will be gaps because it's not a perfect solution. But that, to a certain extent, doesn't matter as long as the humans are competent because they can make up those gaps that are going on. And that's a big assumption. It also makes an assumption that the training agency materials are intact and they cover everything that needs to be done, that the environment is in line with what we need to do. And we haven't, the other pressures that are involved, like time and resource and money and visibility and health, all of those things all contribute to success or failure. So now I've sort of set the scene from a systems point of view, I'll go back into these stories. So the first one's challenge a disaster, and that's where this term, the normalisation of deviance, not the normalisation of deviancy, the normalisation of deviance. And the important bit to get out of this is that no rules were broken. NASA had got a sign-off process to manage the risks. And as one of my colleagues said, Challenger was risk managed right up to the point it exploded 73 seconds after launch. They had basically said, yes, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. It was the social acceptance within the organization that they were doing the right thing. They were gradually moving the margins. So in the diving space, think about how much creep there is, how much is acceptable, how much is tolerated. When things go wrong, who holds that potential loss? And most of the time, it's the instructor who's left holding the baby, sitting there going. Now, the way that a lot of the risk loss is managed in diving is through liability waiver forms. So what we do now is we transfer that risk, which is one of the ways of treating risks. We can treat it, tolerate it, transfer, terminate, transfer the risk to the insurance company. So when the proverbial hits the fan, it all goes wrong. I've followed my standards. I've got the paperwork signed. It's now an insurance problem to solve and settle the monies. And the thing here is, does learning really happen? Because if we transfer it to the insurance company, often very little gets released, but we don't tell those stories. Next bit, I mean, this is a quote from Diane Vaughan's book, which is where the quote came from, illustrates how disastrous the consequences can emerge from the banality of organizational life. This was normal stuff that was going on. They'd been gradually eroding the margins and they hadn't realized the significance of it. Another piece that came out of Diane Vaughan's book was this idea of structural secrecy. So there's a guy here, Richard Cook, really bright guy. He was brought in to look at what was going on at that time. And he identified some of these risks, and it's like, that's not our problem. And I have this feeling sometimes where I come in and go, where's the human factors or the systems thinking bit? What do you know, Gareth? You're not a diving instructor, and actually you haven't dived for a long time because you've got some medical issues. So actually what you're saying is not necessarily relevant. Most of that, well, apart from the relevancy bit, is true. I'm not a diving instructor, but I am really experienced in the human factors system thinking space and the ability to see a system failing. The other bit here that came out in this sort of same part of the book was the shift in how they moved decisions. So when Challenger was earlier on, before the launch failed, they had this bit that says basically it was an experimental platform and we need to show that it is safe. So what was happening here is the sign-off process was that the engineers had to go through this review process and convince the decision makers that it was safe to launch Challenger. So convince me that I should send the shuttle. Just beforehand, as the pressures came on, the time pressures that were, and the financial pressures that were coming to bear on NASA and the rocket booster company, Theodore, and I've forgotten the name, sorry, the rocket booster company, they were basically saying, let's shift the emphasis. Convince me that I shouldn't send it. So I flipped this round. And now it's the assumption is it is safe. Show me why it's unsafe. And this argument appears quite often in the diving space. Where's the evidence that if we mandate checklists, it will make a difference? Like in diving? Well, there isn't any because nobody's done any research. Where's the evidence that if we mandate human factors training in the diving space, it'll make a difference? There isn't any because it hasn't been done, but it has been done in other spaces. Now, unfortunately, a number of years later, they lost Colombia for the same organizational reasons. Financial pressures, drift that was going on, the tiles that broke free when they were hit by this big chunk of ice that came off the fuel tank. Those tiles were known to be falling off fairly regularly. And some of the servicing engineers had come up with some shortcuts about how to, instead of what was going to be a many-hour project, became a few-hour project by how they applied that the glue to the tiles. The modeling of impact of ice was done on a chunk of ice much, much smaller than that fell off on the launch and hit the leading edge, which then burnt through as they entered the atmosphere. So it wasn't until they lost both of these, they went, hang on a minute, this is an organizational issue. It's not just fix the broken humans that we're dealing with. Now, there's a number of papers that use the sort of Challenger and Columbia as examples of lack of organizational learning. And one of these, they used a Hercules, Coast Guard Hercules, and they set the scenario up that they had to go and do an urgent task, which was about pollution control. But the aircraft was operating in a really cold environment. There was a seal, an engine oil seal that was leaking, and it was sort of within limits. But if they lost that, if they had to shut down the engine, the fuel loads and the range they were dealing with, the aircraft would have to ditch. And the crew would likely end up in the water, and they'd probably die of hypothermia because of the temperatures that were involved. Now, interestingly, 84% of those, nearly 84%, said, yeah, we'll launch it. And then they went, there's some more information here. 70%, yeah, we'll still launch it. So when we have these drivers, these pressures, we don't necessarily know what the losses are. And we'll come on to emergency action plans in the diving space, because here's some examples of where drift is happening in the diving arena. Gas density. There's plenty of research that says we shouldn't be diving air, especially on rebreathers, below 30 meters. How many people have accepted that? Oh, it's tolerable. Okay. What about analyzing gas? Well, we only analyze when we've nitrox trained. How do you know what's in your cylinder? Fitness or health assessments. I saw a piece posted by tauscher.net this morning talking about obese divers. And funny old thing, people jump on and go, BMI is rubbish. Yeah, okay, fine. It might not be a great measure, but it does give some level of fitness. And I know some of the agencies have removed timed swims from their professional development programs. And their argument is a rescue is better than no rescue. Okay, I'm not convinced about that. The bottom, risk transfer to insurance companies or doctors. If you sign off if the doctor signs off on the medical and says you're fit to dive, then actually it's their insurance that pays. And so we're talking about transferring that. And something that's an issue in the south of the States and certainly in the UK is the reduction in the hyperbaric chamber treatment coverage. And we sit there going, it's a discretionary activity. Hyperbaric oxygen treatment makes more money than it does in sort of treating divers. Therefore, let's move those away. So there's a lot of erosion of margins in safety. And as I presented at Rebreather Forum 2 years ago, fundamentally, there's not enough dead divers to make a difference. And that's how we measure safety, unfortunately. So the next piece we talk about is the shoot down. Practical drift and the margins that we're dealing with. So in this occasion here, 1994, it was coming to the end of the first Gulf War. They'd finished the combat operations. They were now in peacekeeping operations in northern Iraq and southern Turkey. And what was happening here is we had an airborne warning control system, AWACS, sitting there monitoring the airspace. And we had fighter jets that were there to provide air cover in case any of the Iraqi helicopters came to attack the peacekeeping forces or peacekeeping operations that were happening. And then we had some US Army Black Hawk helicopters who were moving around, moving peacekeepers and aid workers around the mountainous area. Now, all of the tasking was coordinated on something called the Air Tasking Order, and each squadron, each unit gets given their tasking notice. The Black Hawks weren't on that ATO because they had such sort of freedoms, and as a consequence, the AWACS didn't know there were going to be some Black Hawk helicopters launching. The equipment that would identify them, the Mode 4 IFF, wasn't working properly, which the AWACS didn't know about. So the Black Hawks get airborne, they fly around the mountains, and they appear on the AWACS scopes. And it's like, task the F-15s to go and look at that. So they go and have a look, and they visually, rules of engagement said they've got to do a visual identification. So the Black Hawks are in front, the F-15s fly by, and they've got an overtake speed of about 300 knots on top of these helicopters. So they're doing 5 miles a minute on top of the speed of the helicopters. And they pull up and go, hip, hind, and they check their little visual identification books, and they look at this and go, yep, they're hinds. So they ask for clearance from the AWACS. The AWACS gives them clearance to engage, but to visually confirm again. So they roll in behind Black Hawks, confirm in their head that they are hinds, because that's what they were looking for, and shot both the aircraft down, one each. Now, the problem was, when they started to look at this, was that that's what a hind looks like, and the Black Hawk on the left-hand side's got external fuel tanks. The visual identification booklets that the fighter pilots had got were clean Black Hawks, and there were photos from the front. So they were looking at them coming into land, not rear angle shots with pylons, with external fuel tanks that looked like rocket pods. So in their mind, they were doing the right thing. Now, where this idea about practical drift comes from is this book from Scott Snook, Friendly Fire. And he starts off the book and he says, the more I looked for the guilty party, the person to blame, the more I found was that it was largely normal people behaving in normal ways in a normal organization. And what they had done over time, this in, say, combat operations, you have a certain amount of margin, that's the blue line, to play with. And each of the stakeholders gets given a chunk of that. And that's what the standard operating procedures, the ATO, the ATMs, the ACO, the Airspace Coordination Order are about. Everybody can operate in their own little space, and they've got what's happening. Now, the problem is, and that works in a combat situation where everybody's at high tempo and you've got to manage these margins. What happened in the peacekeeping operations is there wasn't that imperative. There wasn't that sort of pressure. And what happened is each one of the stakeholders expanded their own little operational space. They were drifting, but because they hadn't eaten up all of the mission space, the blue line, they thought they were fine. And so each one of those stakeholder units had drifted away from the standards. Now think about the diving industry, the training agencies eating some of that space, the dive centers eating some of that space, the instructors eating some of that space, the divers eating some of that space up. Now, in most of the time, it doesn't really matter because we've got enough margin, enough capacity. But in this particular case with Linnea Mills, that capacity eroded really, really quickly. And in the case of the shoot down, it was just over 2 minutes from detecting the aircraft to rolling in and shooting both Black Hawks down. And that collapsed the time. And that's what we're talking about here, is they've used up that margin, which we think is available. Now, in the clinical human factors group, this is now headed by a guy called Martin Bromley. Now, when his wife died and they looked at the investigation, well, they didn't actually have an investigation because he said, I presume there's an investigation. They went, no, it's one of those things. It's an accident. It's a terrible accident. So hang on a minute, I come from the aviation space. Then actually we need to look into these to find out the deeper causes. The fact that my wife died is an outcome. What are the causes, the contributory factors, the conditions that lead to that event? And Martin's done a fantastic job leading the charge on this. And about 3 or 4 years ago, they stood up the Health Services Safety Investigation Body, which is similar to the Air Accident Investigation Branch, the Rail Safety Board, and the Maritime Accident Investigation Board. So there's now a formal investigation body. Now, the whole point of these is to try and find the gaps between what's written down, this work is imagined, work is prescribed. So what you think about, what you write down, and then what we've got as work is disclosed, what people will tell you and what they actually do. Now, what we need to find that gap, to discover that gap, is psychological safety, that shared belief that it's okay to ask a question, to challenge the status quo, to basically ask, contribute, hey, this isn't a good idea, and a just culture that is the recognition that we all make mistakes. It doesn't matter how experienced we are, we will all make a mistake. Now, the gap between those three boxes is organizational risk in a normal setting. And it applies in the diver training system, not so much the fun system that's out there. And this is a colleague of mine, you can't fix a secret. And that was one of the key bits that came out of the research that I did at Lund. Now, moving on to that, the goal was to try and find out what the barriers were. And we've got two key areas: organizational cultural factors and the event and what it was and how to tell that story. And those are interdependent. They revolve around the bit in the middle, which basically says, what are the barriers? And this is what the mess looks like when we talk about these interdependencies. Now, if I sort of focus on here, the organizational piece, the fear of telling a story, fear of being penalized by others, fear of being made fun of, fear of instructors' mistakes being used as a commercial weapon to say, don't go with them because they're unsafe. There's a tension between learning and litigation and speculation. How do we share those stories? And the limited trust that exists across and between stakeholders. And I would say that actually trust is pretty low in the diving space. At the individual level, we talk about what is an incident, what is an event. There's no clear definition. What's the context, the conditions that lead to that, these error-producing conditions that are there. Often we focus on the proximal cause. They were the last to touch it. How to tell a story, and then how to create that learning through the sharing of context-rich stories, like the documentary If Only. The number of people who sit there and go, oh, there are so many more things to this. And that's why I'm really grateful for Richard for putting all of that story, for distilling the ideas, and why this video here is about bringing this stuff to life. Now, what does an incident mean? And I had nearly 700 people fill in a survey, and then I did a thematic analysis. So one of them was deviation from a plan. And I hate this phrase, plan the dive, dive the plan. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. There's always adaptations and workarounds, even minor ones. And what we could end up with is sticking with the plan because you don't want to fail and you feel that you haven't achieved those goals. A potential for harm or actual harm. Well, hang on a minute. We go diving in an inherently hazardous environment. So there's always a potential for harm. And what does a near miss mean? That's what people will talk about incidents. But many people treat incidents as successes because I got away with it. Cool. I won't do that again. Well, what was that? I won't do the outcome. But did you know what led to that? What were the conditions, the factors that were there? No, I just won't do that. I won't run out of gas. Okay. And if we don't look at the conditions and the context, then the events are going to occur the same way. So we need to debrief. We need to reflect on that. Now, what was a real surprise for me was out of the nearly 700 responses, only 2 said an incident provides a learning opportunity. But if people don't think that incidents provide learning, why would they share them and why would they report them? Which is it's a fair call. If we don't see them as learning, there we go. So what does risk mean? That was another bit that came out of this. So this is what the fun divers said. This is what the instructors said. And that I found quite interesting. It doesn't surprise me because it's about protecting ourselves and transferring that liability onto, say, the insurance company or the individual. And I don't believe we do risk management in the diving space. We do liability management and we do uncertainty management. And this is a slide from Ted Clark's presentation at Boston Sea Rovers this last weekend. And he's got an online program which is all about risk management. And I've seen it. It's good. It's really informative. I think the best bit that's in there is about putting together an emergency action plan. But a lot of this is about how do you protect yourself as an instructor. What we have to understand is why and how people behave the way they do. And for that, we've got to go into behavioral economics. We've got to look at cognitive behaviors and the psychology of group behaviors. When we look at risk, risk always has a positive, a gain, and a loss. When we go diving, the gain is to go and explore the underwater world. In the case of Linnea Mills, it was about getting a Drysuit course done, where Bob Gentry talks about his drivers to get things done. It's about moving forward. It's not about loss. But whenever we talk about unsafe behaviors and risky behaviors, consider what people are trying to do to achieve. What are they moving towards, not what they're moving away from? So understanding those, and these concepts are not taught in the diving space, and actually in the main health and safety space, this behavioral economics is not taught either. It's about compliance. So what we then talk about is, the reason why I linked incident risk, because they're together. Now, in the diving space, especially in the social media area, what you look for is what you find. If you go looking for human error, you'll find human error. If you go looking for technical fault equipment, we'll find that. If we look for non-compliance and paperwork, we'll find that. When you go looking for something, you will find it. Whereas actually what we're trying to do is understand the wider system. Now, we have got a system on the left-hand side where we've got OSHA, Health and Safety Executive WorkSafe, ISO, RISA, training agencies. All of these provide standards, guidance, rules to follow. And then we have sort of feedback systems, which aren't very effective inside the training systems, having spent a bunch of time inside quality management for one of the training agencies. But what we want to do is have some level of feedback, and we've got other sources of data that sit outside, and that might be social gatherings, it might be safety conferences, it might be dive shows, and this is where stories get shared, and hopefully they go back into the pool of knowledge. But I'd ask the question really, how much changes inside the wider system? Because this bit is broken. The feedback, for a bunch of reasons, is not as effective as it could be or should be, and I'm conscious that that's a counterfactual. But one of the bits that came out of the research was actually we've got a paradox of dysfunctional systems, and a system does, purpose of the system is what it does, not what it claims to do. So what we look at is what's out there, what does the system do? And I say, what does the diver training system do? My biased, cynical view is it's about teaching instructors how to teach students how to pass a class against a bunch of standards that are there. At the agency level and how it is managed from a quality point of view, I don't believe it is there to prepare divers to dive autonomously in the real world with the vagaries that are out there. Now, some of the instructors, and the reason why I think from, at an individual instructor level, that might be there. But at an agency level, I don't believe that's the case. And I might get a bit of hate mail back, but I don't care about that. Because actually, you look at the quality that's out there, and it's not as good as it could be. Now, 3 years ago, I gave a presentation at Diving Talks about compliance provides an illusion of safety in diving. And it was quite ironic that there was a presentation about ISO standards for rebreathers, and there was also about what does good look like, what is good enough in the diving space. And so as long as everything is fine, we've met the minimum standards, then everything's safe. But minimums become targets. If the agencies really want to raise the bar, you've got to raise the standards, because human nature says we go for the minimums. And the video on the right-hand side is from a guy called Drew Ray. And this was a global health and safety conference. And he basically said, all the paperwork you're doing protects the organization. It doesn't necessarily protect the worker in these high hazard industries. What we're trying to do with this fail safety piece is, and I touched on it earlier when I had the slide, we're trying to put things in place. So non-technical skills, human factors, psychological safety on the left-hand side, and just culture so we can learn. But then bringing this all the way back to the Linnea Mills case is the sort of a summary. When I copied and pasted all of Richard's words into a Word document, there's 10,000 words. That's 20 pages of A4 letter. So there's a lot of stuff that's there, and I can't cover all of the details in here. But in terms of a brief summary, an enthusiastic, energetic young lady who wanted to go diving. And there was a question asked before she went into the water about, are you happy about this? In terms of weighting and the gear configuration, the fact that the Drysuit hose wasn't configured. And her response was, I guess I will be okay. And there's this real bit that really annoys me when people go, she should have challenged. She's an autonomous open water diver. She should have questioned what was going on. And I call BS on this. This is about authority gradient. This is about trust. And this response here, I guess I will be okay. This was trusting the instructor to do the right thing. The Drysuit itself had got a low pressure inflate connector that was different to the Drysuit feed that came from the regulator set that was hired from the dive center. Now, when I first started to dive in UK 2006, 2007, there was a Halcyon delayed surface marker buoy which didn't have a cap on the inflate. You just put it into the low pressure inflate, let it go, and it had a seal on there, and it would go. So it was self-sealing bag, and you couldn't connect the nipple onto the low pressure feed. There was a knockoff from a company, and I can't remember, it doesn't matter what the company was. When you put that nipple into your low pressure inflate, the nipple pressed the plunger in, and the plunger didn't release on the low pressure inflate, and it pissed gas everywhere. So you had a free flowing low pressure inflate gas. So the fact that even if you've got something that's designed, it may not work. Now, in this case here, that nipple and the Drysuit connector were not compatible. And I've had people say, yeah, I've been on a dive where I didn't have that connected for whatever reason. The advanced open water class that she was doing an adventure dive as a Drysuit as a Drysuit speciality. I know that PADI have changed the standards since that, and there's a fallout from this case. At that time, the Drysuit speciality had half a page of notes and risk management advice in the adventure dive advanced open water class. On a Drysuit speciality, that was 6 pages of stuff that was there. Now, at that stage, you didn't have to be certified as a Drysuit dive instructor to be able to teach on the advanced open water class. And this is one of my big sort of concerns, and I don't think anything, well, it's one thing that didn't change and I think really should, is the self-certification process. That the agencies say we have quality management and we ensure that happens, but you can sign off on a certain number of dives and then become qualified to teach a certain activity. Where's the quality management in that space? The dives themselves that were running up to this didn't really meet any of the standards. And Linnea entered the water and then appears to fall and back off a shelf and sunk, and then was trying to be chased down by divers there, not the instructor. It wasn't until much later that she got involved. The emergency response, they had to drive, I think it was 11 or 13 miles to get to cell phone signal. This was a national park with no coverage in that area. There was snow and ice on the ground. They hadn't contacted the National Park Service to let them know that was going on. There was somebody nearby. But fundamentally, there's an assumption that if something had gone wrong, it would all be okay and they could recover it. And a number of questions I'm going to ask later on is, consider how you fail safely in that situation. And then the changes and the fallout of this. My real want would be I would love to speak to Debbie Snow, the instructor, to find out how it made sense for her to do what she did on that day. She may have been absolutely incompetent as we look on because of all of the fallout that was going on, the failures, the continued numerous failures that were there. But I don't believe she went there on that day to sit there and go, you know what, somebody's going to die on my watch. It must have made sense for her to do what she did. So we look at the sort of the context. Debbie Snow was an inexperienced instructor. She passed her second IEE at the IDC. She got very limited time in terms of diving dry suits, no real experience of diving at altitude or cold water in that situation. It was a long drive. It was 3 hours plus drive to get to the dive site. They arrived with about an hour and a half to go to dusk, so it was going to get dark. There was mixed classes between an advanced open water and a dry suit speciality. The confined water of the dry suit hadn't been done. There were numerous failures in the process, in the standards that were there. Equipment changes and failures that happened. The training system is optimized for reselling. Go and do another course, do another course, do another course. And that doesn't really help when it comes to maintaining standards. If you can certify a certain number of dives, you can move up the ladder. Inexperienced students and staff. There were a number of divers who are operating in supervisory roles, but didn't hold the qualifications or the certifications to do so. And as a consequence, trying to supervise something that you don't know is supposed to be done is a bit of a problem. And a number of weeks ago, I wrote a blog about you can't manage a hazard, you can't risk assess a hazard if you don't know that hazard is present. And the final bit is about conflicts and confusion in the training materials, mismatch between what was going on. Now, what I would have done, and I'm not going to because the audio, it won't play as well as I really wanted to. So what I'm going to do is I will go to the timestamp of the, and so that ties into this Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm going to go to the timestamp and post this in the Human Factors in Diving Facebook group. And the reason why I'm going to post this is because this is probably one of the most powerful pieces of reflection that you will hear in the diving space.
Okay. I would like to preface this whole thing with the idea that I know that as I begin to tell my story, there's going to be bells and whistles go off to everybody that hears it. I was there, and these things, I did have second thoughts. There were things that were driving my motivation, such as I was trying to get my daughter and I certified for dry suits since the end of spring. And this thing kept dragging on and dragging on. Unbeknownst to me at the time, it was because of Chris's leaving and Debbie taking over, and Debbie's organizational skills lacked. And I wasn't aware of that. There was always just excuses, and things went on and on and on. So everything drug out quite a bit. So I was wanting to get this finally done. The other thing is just the bravado of, I've dove all sorts of weird circumstances and have had issues with other dive partners. And, I figured I could handle things. That's not a great excuse. And it's not what you want to do, to lay safety aside because you think you can handle it. But when you think you can handle it, you're too ignorant to know otherwise. And I accept that fact. And, the other part is that, here was this woman that should have been a great example to my 14-year-old daughter. That the reason I cherish diving is that I got certified when I was 16, and it opened a door in that I felt I was capable of doing anything. And because of that attitude, it led to me being able to do a lot of stuff. That fear of the reason you don't accomplish things in life is a fear of not trying. So you don't try, so you automatically fail. And so that's what scuba diving gave to me in all walks of my life. And I cherished it. And so I wanted that experience for my daughter. My daughter was certified at 13. And, then we went to the dry suit class. And this was going to be an opportunity to take my young daughter and help mold her to be a successful person. And I thought a woman diver would be a great example for my daughter. So those three things, and probably others, but those three things really allowed me to just kept stepping over all the problems as they appeared in this situation. I mean, when you get done here and you're just not gonna believe it's possible. But anyway, and then the second thing is when you guys try to friggin' uh, give these comments of I should have this, I should have that. In this circumstance, I got 4 years of every day thinking I should have this, I should have that. You're not going to come up with anything new. And as of yet, Linnea is still gone. It hasn't solved anything. So if you want to do that in the comments, that's fine. But really, you have. I'll be beating myself up when you've long forgotten about this story. It will live with me forever. So you don't have a chance to out what if me, not in this circumstance.
Ashley and If Only and the dive team there, really powerful. This is on the same level from Bob Gentry. And the title of this was about goal fixation and running the hurdle race. And when I listened to Bob talking about his wanting to get his daughters diving so that he could share their experience, or he could get them to experience his experience of being in the underwater world, and he was driven towards that. And it all made sense to him. And the reason I say it, running a hurdle race, is because when sprinters run a hurdle race, they will knock some hurdles over. But they don't stop there and look back and say, oh, I've knocked that over. They carry on going. And that's what we're talking about here. And the other really powerful piece is where he talks about, for the last 4 years, I've been thinking about this. Linnea is not going to come back. And if you think that you can outthink me when it comes to counterfactuals of what ifs, and you thought about that, you are not going to do that at all. So it's a really powerful piece. I'll put the link in the Facebook group. Now, one of the things that I often bring into safety presentations and things like this is, what does normal look like? Disorganized administration. That was one of the sort of contributory factors that's there. Is that normal? Yeah. Time pressures, real and perceived. How many dive centers run courses back to back so there's no flexibility? And so it could be that students come in and go, I need a course done because I'm going on a holiday next Saturday. And you go, hey, if I don't do it, somebody else will take that client. Combining courses, and it's allowed, it's inside standards that you can combine certain courses to achieve certain goals. That's a good use of resources until you start mismatching things. Incomplete feedback. Having been the quality manager for one of the training agencies, I would hear stories from them because they trusted me as a person. It would be to Gareth rather than to Director of Risk Management. I would hear that and I say, can you share that? It's like, no, I'm not going to share that. But so how do we fix this? That, fundamentally, there are major problems there. Very short dive times, where we measure a dive as 20 minutes, 6 meters, 20 feet, crack on. That's it. And in this case here, they were even shorter than that. And the certifications were still issued for some of those divers who didn't complete the dives. You sit there and go, where's the quality management that goes on? Overweighted divers. 45 pounds is a massive amount of lead to put into a diver, and in a way that you couldn't ditch it. So it was zipped into the BC pockets and it was zipped into the Drysuit pockets. Overweighting, paradoxically, you sit there and go, well, I just stick more weight in them because then they're not going anywhere. Well, yes, but you now need more gas, and you're more likely to get a rapid ascent when you have more gas, because for every kilo of extra weight on the surface, you need another litre. And if you're 100 feet or 30 meters, that's another 4 liters of gas that's going to expand as you go up. Incorrect gear or modified gear, absolutely, that's a commonplace thing. Inexperience in the equipment that's being used or the role that's there. And if you tick all of them, I would say yes, is normal across there. It's probably not normal to have all of those happen at the same time. And that, to me, is the big issue, is the fact that this is an emergent situation. The chances of this event occurring in the same way of this sort of scenario, really, really unlikely. But each one of those little things can contribute. Now, I often get this, it won't happen to me because, and we've got this idea of distancing through differencing. I'm different to them. I'm not stupid. I wouldn't make those mistakes. I have those things in place that prevent that. And here's a bunch of questions for you. So if you say it couldn't happen to you, what processes and procedures do you have that would prevent such a catastrophic event from occurring? When was the last time you validated them? Emergency action plan. Have you got one? And when was the last time you tested it? I know there's somebody on the call here went on a liveaboard to the Red Sea, and their protocols were check the oxygen, check that they got a defib on the boat, and they went round. And they checked that the defibrillation, they had a defib machine. Now, unfortunately, on day 2 of their dives, one of their guests had a heart attack, and they went to get the defib. They put the paddles on, and they couldn't get a charge. And they were on the dive deck. The paddles started to break down, and it wasn't until they opened up the defib machine to realize the battery was wrapped in plastic. And the reason the battery is wrapped in plastic is because they're expensive, and they need time to be replaced, and their time expired. So it makes sense that a dive boat will wrap a battery in plastic. Now, if you're in an emergency situation, that's not what you want. So you might want to put a bloody great sticker on here that says unwrap battery before you end up being called on it. So the other thing is, as an instructor, a dive center manager, or an agency, how often do you hear bad news? If you're only hearing the good stuff, then there's something missing. What happened to the last person who challenged the status quo? I know what happened when I was in the roles that I was in, and it became really difficult to try and get change. I've talked about that was lucky, I won't do that again. What does that mean? And the next bit then, and this is really hard to get away from, is if you just focus on the outcomes, run out of gas, rapid ascent, entangled, but we don't look at the contributory factors that lead to that, we're not going to do any learning. And this was one of my major criticisms of a paper that was written, I'm going to say 2008 by Dan Petard Noble and Richard Van, talking about the causes of recreational fatalities. And it's either 37 or 43%, and I can't remember the number. The trigger event was running out of gas. It's like, great, that doesn't help us. Everybody on the call, don't run out of gas on a dive. Because you sit there and go, of course we don't. What we don't understand is those reasons behind. So nearly all of the data that's out there focuses on proximal causes, close in time and space, as opposed to the wider context in which we're talking about. And the final piece, and this has been added since I gave the presentation at Go Diving, was about this concept of a scapegoat, where it's much easier just to pin it on an individual and say, Debbie Snow was the failed instructor. She's the one last to touch it, and therefore it's her fault. And you sit there and go, and if we basically pin it on her, we now absolve ourselves. And I found the history behind this in sort of Jewish religion of sacrificing a goat, so sacrificing a goat for God, and then putting all of the sins in the other goat, and then sending it off into the wild. And then we, as the tribe, were safe, and therefore we were clean. And just think about how that's used in any of the events that you see in media, social media, whereas actually we could just pin it on one person, get away. It's like Decker talks about the bad apple. If we get rid of the bad apple, then everything's okay, but the barrel might be rotten. What we have to do is look at things from a different perspective. And unfortunately, the animation doesn't show this. It'll swing around. But this is the same graphic that we're talking about. We look at it from different sides. Adverse events occur as deviations from normal, not from rules. The rules might be normal, or normal might be rules, but often they're not. How is it that people are creating safety as they go along? And again, this is not going to show quite so well because the stuttering of the video. But Andreas is one of the human diver instructors, and Pepe is holding the camera.
What you're leaving for me.
Look at what you're leaving for me. And Andreas pulls that brick out. The tower collapses, and it's a great discussion to have to say, was this Andreas's fault? You say, well, yeah, because he pulled the brick out. But what about the unstable tower that's already there? Thinking about dive instructors, divers inheriting what I would say is broken systems. And we are managing safety all the time in an inherently hazardous environment. What we have to do is learn about the context we're in. And that requires us to tell stories. And for that to happen, we've got to have a just culture in place. Each one of these images is an individual looking at a bigger part of a story. And it's the context that matters, because that's how we learn the conditions that are there. The takeaways I'd get is that the world of diving is messy. It's not linear. It's not a cause and effect thing. There are so many things that come together for success as well as failure. We are all incompetent and unaware to some extent. When you go into a novel space and you don't have experience, you are incompetent and you are unaware. In the face-to-face training programs, the applied skills programs that the human diver delivers, we put people in a novel, incompetent space, flying a prototype spacecraft, and they all fail. And we expect them to fail because they're all incompetent. Compliance only gets you so far. As humans, we finish the design. We take that book and we adapt it to the real world. There is no way you could write down the procedures for everything that happens, because the world doesn't work that way. The outcomes, the events, are pretty uninteresting. They're very emotive, like in this case here, but actually it's the context and the conditions that are way more important, because we can do that. James Reason said we can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions in which humans are working. Change the language we use. Look at understanding how it made sense, not why did they do that. And that links into this piece about curiosity and suspending judgment and the need to hear that second messy story. In Bonaire last year, I ran a little research project, and I gave people a 300-word account of a narrative and an 1,100-word account of a narrative. People were less likely to judge, or they didn't judge the longer story as much as they did the first one. But what was interesting, out of I think I had about 18 people, 2 people only read about 300 words of the 1,100 story because they got bored. We're in a situation where actually, how do we help the learning if people don't necessarily want to learn and grow? That bit here, if we don't have feedback, you can't improve, and we can't fix that secret. And this ties right back to the bit with the Dark Star takeoff. When the margins are small or eroded, like they're happening in the diving sector, because things don't go wrong and we don't notice them and people don't share those stories, we can't just rely on luck, because that is not a great plan. And the whole sort of goal of the human diver is about being better than yesterday. Understand that we can get better. We can take these ideas. And there are loads of resources available for you if you want to go and visit Human Diver. There's a podcast, which has got about 150 episodes in it now. And that's free. The book is available from websites, available on Audible, and it's available in Kindle and other ebooks. The If Only documentary is available on the Human Diver website, and there's a work guide or workbook that allows you to run a workshop at your dive center or your own training center or university, whatever it is. So you can do that. And then there's loads of blogs themselves on the Human Diver site. And we've got a bunch of training that basically goes from self-paced online, which some instructors mandate it as pre-learning. And if you're interested in that, get hold of me. We've got applied skills face-to-face programs and a 10-week masterclass series that runs twice a year. And that ends this sort of presentation. So I talked a little bit more than I planned, but there's a lot of stuff to cover. I'm now going to sort of end this bit. And I'm going to go through the chat and see what's in here. Oh, no questions. So there we go. Thanks very much, Gretchen. If anybody's got any questions to add, there's a lot of stuff in there. I get that. But if you've got questions, type them in there and I'll see what I can do. I don't know if you want to add anything, David, from your perspective, having been massively involved in this. It's probably the most knowledgeable and the back end stuff that isn't available. Yeah, go for it. So you should be able to unmute yourself and put yourself out on video as well.
I can unmute, but I can't put myself on video.
Oh, okay. Hang on a minute. Maybe because I turned your video off. There we go. So, ask to start video. How's that?
Yeah.
Cool.
First of all, I'd like to thank you. In the 4 years since I wrote and filed the Linnea Mills complaint, this is only the second time I've been asked to speak to a diving audience. And the first was the dive talk video. Um, there's a lot of takeaway. When I wrote the Linnea Mills complaint and the amended complaint, which was even more detailed, I did it with the intent to start a conversation. Because in the more than 300 fatality investigations I've been involved in, there were so many repeats in Linnea's case. There were so many instances. I mean, she was the second person to die that year from not having a dry suit connected and being overweighted. She's not the only person. She was the second that year. So there's so many. Lots of people go in the water overweighted. Lots of people go diving in places where they're beyond help, or they don't have the tools to save themselves if they have a very, very predictable occurrence. Um, the standards, for example, for PADI that allow indirect supervision for an advanced open water class, but direct supervision for a dry suit class haven't changed. And if the mixing of classes, which is less of an issue if you've got the same things, the the lessons learned are so lengthy, but they're so simple and they're so common. Mentorship,
Mhm.
um, evaluating equipment from the rental locker before you give it to a student, um, checking on experience, having people with the right experience in a leadership position instead of having junior open water certifications for people that
Yeah,
were assisting. They just go on and on and on and on and on. And I don't have to relitigate the Linnea Mills case, but I would love to educate people about what happened. I'm grateful that there have been over 1 million views on the myriad of videos that have come from that complaint. And it's ironic, it was 12 hours ago that I received the 911 tapes. 12 hours ago, today, 1:30 in the morning. Um, and you get confirmation that which we didn't need from the tapes, but that somebody had to drive 11 miles through the wilderness along a lake at night to make a cell phone call. So they just, there's so many things that everybody on this call can learn about their own actions and checking their equipment, making sure that it's well maintained, checking the credentials of the people they're diving with or trusting. Um, just on and on and on and on. But thank
absolutely. And it's the frustration is that the lessons aren't learned because the learning requires change, and there has to be some trigger for that. And I know there's a sort of real pushback of, oh, we don't want diving to be regulated. But in a free market economy, in a hazardous environment, self-regulation doesn't work in this sort of situation.
Yeah, I see it getting worse. There's just no shortage of phone calls that I get about the latest fatality, and I might get one today
Mhm.
about fatality yesterday.
Yeah,
Uh, and I don't know anything about that fatality yet, but I believe that I will know that I do know that if I do get a call, it will not be anything unfamiliar.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. That to me is the travesty that the outcomes that we know about, nothing is new. What we're not doing is addressing the construct that sits there about leadership, about feedback. And there was a comment: how could someone approach an organization that uses terms like just culture, but only look at the outcomes and not want to look at the actual root causes and the systemic faults? My answer to that, Robert, is unless you understand and accept human error and human performance variability and achieving goals that you're trying to do, you can't create a just culture because that requires you to understand how and why people behave the way they do, what they're trying to move towards, not necessarily what they're moving away from. Because if it's moving away from getting caught, which is often what happens in a sort of a punitive environment, all that happens is the stories get driven underground. And what happens is you end up with a convergence like this of all of these things happen, and people sit there going, how on earth could you get to that? It's like, this wasn't this delta that they were managing. They were looking at little deltas and then managing all those little risks themselves. But we don't manage risk, we manage uncertainties. And those are biases and heuristics. If I don't hear about something going wrong in a certain way, I don't believe it happens. And that emergency action plan, if you sit there and go, well, when was the last time we had an emergency in a remote location? Well, I don't know. Can't remember anybody having an issue like that. Well, therefore, it's not an issue. People go, that's stupid. But that's how our brains work. And we have to educate people in that sense. So Sarah, the comment about sharing, yes, this is recording and I'll put it on the YouTube channel for that. How much we talk about that in diving. We live in a living planet environment, one big factor for gears. Nico, I'm not quite sure what that means. What I can say is the openness of standards when it comes to visibility. And can you directly supervise your students in crappy green quarry water where the visibility might be 6 feet or it might be 3 feet? And then you sit there and go, well, I've got some extra people in the water. So what I'll do is I'll daisy chain them. I'll be as an instructor. I've got a student, I've got a student, I've got a DM, I've got a student, and I've got a DM. You sit there and go, well, I can only see 2 people. What happens if somebody over there has an issue? That sucks. That's wrong. So
can I correct you with one thing, Gareth? The Linnea Mills didn't say, I guess I'll be okay. She was told she would be okay. And then what she did was she shrugged her shoulders and said,
okay, apology.
Deviance and salute. And so, and when you sign a liability waiver, you're not pushing liability onto an insurance company. You're keeping it with yourself. But again, I think it's a real mistake to villainize Debbie Snow. I really do, even though I was the first to do it. It changes the conversation off of what can I do to be better and safer and come home tonight to what did she do that made it impossible for that poor girl to come home tonight. And the thing is that you can there's so many lessons learned. You can evaluate your own condition. You can evaluate your own gear. You can evaluate the conditions you're diving in. You can decide tomorrow's a better day. I don't have to go in now at dusk, not 90 minutes before, but at dusk, because I'll be here tomorrow. I'm staying the night.
Yeah.
We can start this on Monday.
Yeah.
And not on Sunday night.
And it's teaching people about those biases, sunk costs, planned continuation. You go on a liveaboard, and so at the dive show 3 weeks ago, I took the Jenga tower, and I was playing. We basically got it set up and pulled a brick out, and it collapsed. And I said, "Well, was that your fault?" So yeah, because I chose to pull the brick out. So okay, yeah, fine. In this environment, now think if I'd set this up as a competitive environment, where you've got a team over there and a team here, and we're trying to build the quickest tower, the tallest tower as quickly as possible. And there's a big bucket of chocolate over there that you're going to get if you win. If you pull that out, is it now your choice because there's peer pressure? But that's not the same as diving, right? You fly halfway around the world, you spend $10,000 on a trip, and you have gear that doesn't quite work, but I'd sit out. You're going to fly out there and sit out for a whole week on the boat where everybody else is diving wrecks and seeing sharks and everything else like that. And this is the sort of thing that we need to bring to and say, yes, anybody can thumb a dive at any time for any reason. And that includes before you get in the water. But the reality is it's pretty hard to do that. Adam, you said learning is the most important, but what about responsibility? How do we demand change? My view, I've given up trying to work with the training agencies because I've recognized that it's not in the agency's commercial interest to bring some of this in place. And the reason I say that is because it would have to be done at a wholesale level across all the industries. And this is conversations I've had with a couple of the agencies. Because if they said, we mandate some human factors, system thinking training as part of diver development, we would then be a barrier, that would seen as a barrier to new clients coming in. So if an instructor's looking to cross over to an agency and they've got half a dozen to choose from, and they've all got broadly the same standards, and that one over there requires you to do 4 hours of extra e-learning beforehand, and those five don't, well, I'll go over here. And people go, that's nuts. The fact that you're on this channel, this watching the Zoom call, you recognize that's nuts. But it makes commercial sense. And the comment I've had is this would be a commercial barrier to adopting. So what I'm doing is working with ambassadors. I'm working with dive instructors, dive centers, course directors who recognize the value of this. And what they're doing is they're mandating that 4-hour program as part of pre-learning from anywhere from rescue diver through to course director, technical training, all sorts of stuff, because they realize that then gives them a language to talk about that stuff. And to that, I'm really grateful, because the change will happen middle out. It won't happen top down. Next one. How can we remove the stigma in the industry to openly talk about experiences, lessons, learnings? I found that oftentimes people. Right, Michelle, great point here. And that's all about developing psychological safety within a team, within an organization. So to start with, and that's what the debrief framework that we put together, the human diver, the E, so define the aims and goals of the dive. How long's the debrief going to be? E, an example of something that didn't go to plan on that dive for me as the instructor, as the leader, or whatever. And so we have to create that psychologically safe environment. But none of this is taught formally in the instructor development programs. So in effect, the role models that you want, those leaders that are out there, don't have this. And so what's happening is it is people who recognize the value. Creating the Human Factors in Diving Facebook group is a pretty safe environment, and I don't have to be there, which is great. I've got 12 instructors working for the Human Diver dotted around the world. But when people post things in there which go against the whole ethos of psychological safety and a just culture, others jump in and say, out of order, that's not how it makes sense. It's cool. And one of the things as a takeaway for that, Michelle, one of the focus groups from my master's research was to go to the agencies, and none of the agency staff attended the focus groups, which is a real shame. There was one person from the UK said yes, but then nobody else was around. I did try to interview a bunch of people, but there's a bunch of systemic reasons or issues at play. Gretchen, most adults don't have the development maturity to understand the self-responsibility, taking assessments of their own safety. Absolutely. And you think about where a lot of the diving instructors as gap year experiences, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Mexico, Caribbean. Hey, lifestyle choice. I get that. At the same time, you're right. It's not a great role model for that. Adam, go through the contact page on the Human Diver. So the Human Diver /contact-us, or you'll see it up in there. Give us a shout. Anybody else is the same. The only prerequisite is you've got to have done essentials or the applied skills on the masterclass. So you've got some language to deal with. But I've probably got about 35, 40 ambassadors that are out there who recognize the value, and it's sitting there going, you know what, they're willing to have a little bit of a financial investment on their side. It's not a lot, but their students have got a common language to deal with. Thank you very much, David. Anything? I know you just take your glasses off and sat back. So anything else?
No, those are the only comments I wanted to make. I would, again, thanks for sending me the link and inviting me to address the group. I think you and I need to do a bigger audience at a dive show somewhere, just like we did.
Have you slotted Dima? Because I know that
I'm going this year. I haven't for a while. I wasn't welcome actually, but
I've put talk requests in for the last 2 years, and they've been turned down. But I might put another one in, and we'll see what we can do, and
I was on
find a big room.
Discussion with Tom Ingram last night, and he's a neighbor now. He lives in Idaho, but I think you should see what happens. I think there's an appetite for it. I know that a lot of people are. There was a lot of circling of the wagons early on, and there's much less of that now. I still have
Mhm.
the same clients I've always had, but yeah, try it, see what happens.
David, thank you very much. And no, I'm not going to be there, Gretchen. I'm trying to limit myself to about a week a month out the country, and I'm going to be in Great Lakes mid-June, and then Columbus, Ohio. So I'm going to be there for about 10 or 12 days in total. But I think we've got a chat this week anyway. So everybody, thank you very much for all of this. I will put it all up and stick it on the YouTube channel. Excellent. Cheers. Thank you.
Bye bye.